Hello everyone, this is Shira from Jewish Workshops. We are very happy to be here. I would like to thank Rabbi TATZ for taking the time to pre-record this class despite your very busy schedule during your lecture tour. If anyone has any questions, please email Rabbi TATZ at rabbitats@jewishworkshops.com. At this point, I would like to turn the mic over to Rabbi TATZ. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again, and as usual, I'll start by thanking Jewish eBooks for the work that they do. I very much appreciate the channel, the portal, to be able to get Torah out to a much broader audience, and that's really their credit. Also like to mention, as we always do, that Jewish eBooks is launching my new book on free will, and I hope that over the next few sessions we'll talk more about free will issues in depth. Now that we're approaching Shavuot, I wanted to talk about the subject of Torah itself. You know, that's our direct connection with Hashem. That's the direct lifeline. There are really only two ways in which we communicate with Hashem directly. One is tefillah, or prayer, where we speak to Him, and the other is Torah, where He speaks to us. These are our two direct channels of communication. So let's try and talk today a little bit about Torah. I'd like to try to show a depth in Torah that people are usually not aware of, and that is how Torah forms the genes of reality. Try to explain this, and although I won't be able to answer questions live during this session, as usual, you're very welcome to email me on our private email. Anyone wants to talk things over in more depth, just email me. I'll send you my home telephone number. No problem, and we can talk about things in depth. Those of you who live in the places where I'll be traveling in the next few weeks, from the middle of May until the beginning of June, if you go to the Or Sameach website, you'll see a series of sessions, Yom Iyun. I'll be speaking together with Rabbi Orlovsky and Rabbi Gottlieb, both in Brooklyn, Flatbush. That's on the 15th of May, and after that in Toronto, Baltimore, Los Angeles, Chicago, various other places. Please take a look over there. You're very welcome. If you're part of our group, please come and say hi. After one of those sessions, it'll be a pleasure to meet you. And I'll try to talk more in depth on those sessions about some of these subjects. But for now, let's talk about Torah, the genes of reality. What do we mean by that? You know, it's very well known, and you'll find many sources that refer to Torah as the blueprint of reality. Right? You have the reality, the universe that we live in, and Torah is the blueprint of reality. But I'd like to suggest that I think that's slightly misunderstood, because the concept is really that Torah is much deeper than a blueprint. You know, a blueprint, it's true that a blueprint maps to the reality. No question that a building is parallel to the blueprint. The blueprint is produced first, and the builder uses that to construct the building. But, you know, in one sense, there's no need for the building to follow the blueprint. You know, that builder could make a mistake, and he could improvise as he goes along. You might have a building that does not fit exactly the description of the blueprint, and therefore, I think perhaps we can identify a deeper idea in Torah as a blueprint. And I think the concept here is that we should see Torah as more than a blueprint. No, the difference between a blueprint and genes is that the blueprint is a picture of reality, and then you need to follow the picture. But genes is a system of information. The genetic code is a system of information, but it isn't only a library of information. The genetic code is actually the reason that the structure follows. Know that the genes actually run a program. Genes are not simply a library of information. What genes do is they actually construct reality. Now, the genes are a mechanism, a factory procedure for actually producing reality. And therefore, the genes are a mechanism. When the genes run their program, they actually produce the body. And that's what we mean by Torah as the genes of reality. Torah is like a system that actually produces the result. The reason that the universe maps to Torah perfectly is because the Torah projects itself into the universe. This means that the universe, in fact, could not be different than the Torah says, because it is the cause of the pattern of the universe. Right? I would use perhaps another analogy. Imagine you would go and see a movie, right? Imagine there was a movie kosher enough to go and see. I must admit, I personally have not been to a screening of a movie for decades now, right? But I know that I remember the last time I went many years ago. The system was that a light was shone through a film, and that film projects itself onto a screen, so that the film has a series of images, and those are projected onto a screen. And what appears on the screen must have been there on the film, and what is there on the film must be there on the screen. That could not be any different. And therefore, we're not talking about a film that maps to what's on the screen. We're talking about a film that causes what's on the screen. Right? When you see a picture on a screen, if you go back and you look at the film and you find that it has the same pictures and you show any surprise, you're misunderstanding. There's nothing to be surprised at. Of course, what's on the film is exactly as what you saw on the screen. The reason that the picture's on the screen is because it's on the film, right? And similarly with genes. If you take a person who has blue eyes, and then you go and you study the person's genes, and you find that they code for blue eyes, and you're so surprised. You say, wow, that's amazing. This person has blue eyes and his genes agree. That's foolish. Of course the genes agree. The genes came first. The genes are the reason the person has blue eyes. And that is the sense in which we mean that Torah is a genetic map to the world. When you go and examine something deep in Torah, and you find that it describes the world perfectly, there should not be a surprise at the finding that Torah knows the world and describes it. It's much deeper than that. Torah was written before the world was created. And the reason the world looks the way it does is because Torah stipulates that specification. Right? I would say that, the sages tell us that the Torah was written 2,000 years before the world was created. 2,000 years before the world was created. So Torah is like a film, and the film later projects itself onto the screen. And therefore the screen maps perfectly to what you're seeing on the film. You know that this is a very specific correspondence. You know that every word in Torah is corresponding to an object in the world, right? You know that Hebrew is the only language in which the word for a word is the same as a word for a thing. The word davar in Hebrew, the word davar means a word, and davar means a thing. And the reason is that everything in the world is a projection of Torah. Right? Every object in the world is a specific mapping, a specific projection, a specific production of a word in Torah. The davar word in the Torah projects itself into the davar object in the world. Think about it for a moment. How was the world created? Hashem spoke it into being. He spoke the world into existence. Vayomer Elokim, and God said. Doesn't mean he gave instructions, and then some angels or angelic beings, be created reality. That's not the concept. The concept is that when Hashem spoke the word, Vayomer Elokim, Hashem spoke the word, that word projects itself into reality. Right? That word that Hashem speaks, right? That projects itself into reality, and that becomes the fabric of reality that we see. And therefore, every word in Torah is the genetic reality, genetic substance that projects itself into the world. Let's take a few examples and try to understand this more deeply. But the image to bear in mind is always that when you delve into Torah, you're going back into the genetic material, into the formative material. Right? You're looking at the system that actually creates what you are witnessing and what you are experiencing in the world. And therefore, of course, there's a one-to-one mapping. It could not be any different. Take an example, right? An example has an unusual twist in it. You know that twice in the Torah, in Nach, there's a verse that appears that describes a circle. You know that King Solomon, Shlomo Melech, was required to build a pool structure called the Yam Shel Shlomo. It has much Kabbalistic significance. But this Yam Shel Shlomo was a pool, a circular pool, that he needed to build as part of his construction of the temple. And the Torah gives a very interesting specification for this Yam Shel Shlomo. Right? The verse says, you'll find this in Malachim, and you'll find it in Divrei Yomim. The verse says that the pool, v'kav shloshim ba'ama yasov v'oiso yisaviv, a circumference, a line, 30 amas, 30 amot, right? That's 30 cubits, shall surround it going around. That's what in English you call the circumference. V'misvasoi ad svasoi, from lip to lip, eser ba'ama, it shall be 10 amas across. Right? So the instruction was to build a pool with a line circumference of the pool 30 and a diameter of 10. And there are three questions that need to be asked about this verse. And the Gaon of Vilna, whom, as I'm sure you know, was a great mathematician, apart from being the genius in Torah that he was, the Gaon asked three questions about this verse. The first is that if you look in the text, you'll see that the word for circumference is not pronounced the way it's spelt. Right? You know that we have what's called AKIVA and a Kri. Many times in Torah, in the text of Tanakh, you'll find a word pronounced one way, but in fact it is not spelled exactly the same way. And that always represents a differential between an exactitude, something that is written in the text and must be written that way, and the way it's expressed, which is not the way that it's written. And that discrepancy always raises the question of why. Why would you want to specify a thing one way in a written text and then express it differently when you verbalize it, right? There's always a reason for that discrepancy. So here the first question is, why is the word for circumference written one way and pronounced another way? One of them is kav and one is kavva. Kav means circumference and kavva means its circumference, right? So there's some differential here in the circumference of this pool that is expressed by being written one way and expressed verbally another way. That's the first textual question. And I think the other two questions are pretty obvious. The second question is, why would you specify a circumference and a diameter? You know, it's a very basic mathematics, a very basic mathematical understanding realizes that the diameter and the circumference of a circle are clearly related, always exactly the same fashion by the ratio that we call pi. No sensible engineer would specify the circumference and the diameter of the circle. It's completely wasteful. Don't need that. If you tell me that the diameter is a certain measure, the circumference follows automatically. And if you tell me the circumference, the diameter follows automatically. You're in fact insulting my intelligence, insulting my mathematical and engineering wisdom if you tell me both of those, because they are not at all both necessary. And the third question is, not only are they unnecessary, but the ratio is wrong. Right? If the diameter is 10, there's no way the circumference can be 30. The circumference in that case must be 31.4159, etc. And conversely, if the circumference must be 30, there's no way that the diameter can be 10. It must be 9.8, whatever it is exactly. And so we have three problems on this verse. The one problem is that you are having a difference between the specified in the text and the verbalized. The second is that there's an unnecessary specification of diameter and circumference. And most perplexing of all is the fact that it's wrong. We're dealing with Torah here. Right? There's no way the Torah can give a wrong ratio. The Gaon of Vilna asks these questions, and he gives a fascinating answer. The Gaon says, if you take the ratio of the circumference to the diameter, right? Take out your calculator, as I'm doing, and you take the word kavva, which equals 111. Kavva in Hebrew is 111, and you divide it by 106, right? Because kav is 106. In other words, take the gematria of these two words and establish the ratio. Multiply that by 3, because you are talking about 3 units around for every one across. And the answer you get is 3.1415, etc., right? A very, very interesting and close approximation of pi. So the Gaon of Vilna tells you that here you have in this verse a mathematical ratio. When you write the Torah not as words but as numbers, you have the mathematical ratio of pi. And when you express them, you express it, you do not get the ratio of pi, you get an approximation which is 3 to 1. So here you have a discrepancy between the gematria and the verbalized expression. And we know that gematria means a mathematical relationship. So here the Torah is giving you a very close mathematical approximation in its numerical version, but in its verbalized version, the Torah is giving you a very rough approximation of 3 to 1. In fact, I once worked out the discrepancy, and it's about 3%, 3 to 4%. The Gaon explains that this is where the Torah is telling you an exact specification and an approximation. And the reason is that in every mitzvah which requires construction or measurement, one always has to specify the tolerance. In every engineering system, in every engineering project, there's always a specified tolerance. You know, if you're building a table, a few tenths of an inch inaccuracy will be fine. The table will work fine. If you're building a supersonic jet, a few tenths of an inch may not be good enough. And if you're shooting for the moon, you have an astronomical project, a very, very, very small discrepancy will mean that you miss your target by thousands, maybe even millions of miles. And therefore, in every project, you need to specify the degree of accuracy or the tolerance that you need. And the Torah is telling us that in every mitzvah, when you're given a measurement instruction, a rough approximation of 3 to 1 is good enough. So when you make tefillin, for example, right, do tefillin have to be measured by the naked eye? Are they measured with, a pencil, to use a micrometer? How accurate tefillin have to be? And here the Torah is telling you that a 3% error is acceptable. In other words, it's the rough approximation of 3 to 1 is the tolerance that you're required to work to. You need to use a micrometer gauge, and the Torah expresses it because in a format where the gematria, the numerical equivalent, right, of the verbal, is not exactly the same. Normally, of course, we expect them to be the same. This concept of gematria is that you have a verbal expression, and yet you can transpose that verbal expression into numbers, and you get the same system again. That's a remarkable thing. I think this is enough to make you religious instantaneously, in my opinion. You know that in English, if you give a description of a bridge in verbal terms, you can make a poetic description of a bridge, and no doubt the engineer will understand what you mean. But then you can specify the bridge in numbers and give him an engineering formula, and there he will have a mathematical specification. But the difficulty is that in any other language, you have to use two systems. You use a verbal expression on the one hand, and use numbers to give a mathematical expression. The wonder and marvel of Torah is that the two are found in the same notation. You can take an aleph and a base and read them as verbal expressions, and then you can transpose them into their numbers, and amazingly, you'll get exactly the same description of what you had before, but this time in mathematical specification. And so what you have is a verbal specification of ratios in a circle, not exactly accurate, and then you transpose the system into the mathematics, and you get the same thing exactly again, but this time exact. That would be an example. But I think the important thing to grasp here is that our surprise in finding that the Torah ratio is not exact, our surprise should not be because the Torah is perfect and must know the world perfectly. Our surprise should be deeper than that. That is that the Torah specified circles before circles began to be in the world. And therefore the surprise is, when you read this analysis of the Gon, your reaction should be, it's impossible that circles are not 3 to 1, right? Not impossible that the Torah gets it wrong. It's impossible that circles are wrong. The Torah specified circles 2,000 years before circles began to be in the world. And therefore, of course, circles must dance to the tune of Torah. That's the vision we should have. Let me give another example, I think. Once you explore a few examples, I think the picture becomes clearer. Let me give you another example. You know that the Torah, the Gemara points out that based on a verse in Parsha Shmini in the Torah, there are certain animals that have certain features of kashrut that are unique, right? You know, for an animal to be kosher, it needs to have a cloven hoof and to chew the cud. Right? Those are the requirements of a kosher animal. Now, there are only 3 animals in the world that chew the cud, but that have only one of those signs, right? The pig is the only animal that in fact has a kosher hoof, a cloven hoof, but does not chew the cud. And there are other animals that do not chew the cud, but have the reverse. So you've got 3 animals, shafan, arnevet, and gamal, 3 animals that have a solid hoof, but do chew the cud, and you have the pig that does not chew the cud and has a cloven hoof. So there are 4 animals in total that have one sign of kashrut, but not the other. And the Gemara makes it plain from a close reading of the verse that there are these 4 and only these 4. In other words, 3,326 years ago, when the Torah was written, it specified that there are 4 animals in the entire world that have one of these features but not the other. And says the Gemara, how could a human being have written this document? How could any human have specified 3,326 years ago that there are only 4 animals that have these biological features? If Moses had written the Torah himself, if Moshe Rabbeinu had written the Torah himself, that there's no way that he could have known that no animals will ever be found subsequently that will break this rule. You have to remember, the language of the Gemara is V'Moshe Kanigi Haya. Was Moshe Rabbeinu a hunter? Was he an outdoors man? How on earth could he have known that the world contains only these 4 animals that have these features? You know that in 3,326 years ago, when the Torah was written, and even the most anti-Semitic and anti-Torah opinions agree that the text of the Torah that we have is at least 2,000 years old, if not 3,326 years old. And 2,000 years ago, and certainly 3,000 years ago, it is very clear that most of the Earth's surface had not been explored yet. Right? For somebody to make a statement that no animals exist and no animals will ever be found that have features that contradict this statement in the Torah, right, is a rash statement, to put it mildly. Right? The Earth that was known at the time of the giving of the Torah, even up to 2,000 years ago, the surface of the Earth that had been explored and discovered ranged from Ethiopia in the south to Asia Minor in the north and the east. Right? That's all that was known. The rest of the Earth's surface had not been discovered. People thought you'd fall off the edge if you went too far. And therefore, to make a statement about a universe that clearly was unexplored, undiscovered, and to state categorically that no animals will ever be found that have these features beyond the 4 that are mentioned, is an extremely daring statement. And no human being could have made such a statement. And not only that, but we find that over the subsequent 3,300 odd years, no animals have ever been found that have one of these features and not the other. And that clearly is a divine statement. I hate to offend various cultures, but just to mention Americans, hate to say this, but it happens to be true. At the time when the Torah was written, America was totally undiscovered. I'm afraid I have to say the same thing about the Australians and the English. Most of those territories were totally unknown and undiscovered. As I always say, the only highly advanced culture in the world at the time, of course, was in South Africa. But I think that's pretty obvious, and everybody should know that. But apart from that, the surface of the Earth was totally undiscovered. And so to make a rash statement like there are only 4 animals that have these features, right, obviously takes a higher wisdom. But the point I'd like to make about this, that is well known. What I've said is what's written in the Gemara. Many people know that. But I think what people make a mistake about here is they think that the Torah must know that there are no animals besides these because the Torah knows the world perfectly. After all, if the Torah is a divine document, then it must know reality perfectly. And so if the Torah can specify that there are only 4 animals, it does so because Torah knows the world. But I think that's a mistake. I think that's a reversal of the truth. The Torah knows these animals are the only ones because the Torah caused it to be that way. It's a mistake to think that these animals happen to be the way they are because evolution built them that way, or because they were created that way. And the Torah coming lately looks at reality and describes it accurately. That's a mistake. The Torah was written before reality condensed into being. 2,000 years before any animals were created, the Torah specified 4 animals of this type in the spiritual realms. And therefore, when animals crystallize into being in the world, of course there are only 4 of them. There could not be more. The reason there could not be more is because the Torah doesn't contain them. And therefore they never could be in the world. Right? I think that's the right way. That's the right way to understand it. There's a book about this subject written by Rav Simcha Zissel Brady, and he points out many, many examples of things that exist in the Torah and then they exist that way in the world. I mean, one of the classics is the fact that when Esau was looking for Yaakov, right, there were 14 years when Esau was looking for Jacob to kill him, and he couldn't find him. And the truth we know is that Yaakov was learning Torah in the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. But evidently Esau couldn't find him, and the obvious question, the beginner's question is, wouldn't that be the first place to look? Wouldn't Esau, where does he expect to find Yaakov? He's the yeshiva mocher. Yaakov's going to go and look for the yeshiva. There's only one yeshiva at the time. That's the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. Surely he knows exactly where to find him, and yet he cannot discover him there. And what Rabbi Brody points out very beautifully is, of course, he can't find him there. The Torah doesn't say it openly. The Torah does not tell us openly where Yaakov was at the time. And if it's not written in the Torah, in other words, if it's hidden in the text of the Torah, it's hidden in the fabric of reality. And just like you cannot find it in the text of the Torah, Esav could not find him in that zone in the world. But that's one example, and there are many, many other examples. Aaron Kotler used to point out that, it's very, very famously known that the Torah does not contain a statement about the next world, right? You will not find anywhere in the text of the Torah a description of the world to come. Central, fascinating feature of Torah, something we need to discuss on a future occasion. But he used to say this: of course the Torah doesn't talk openly about the world to come. If the Torah spoke openly about the world to come, then the world to come would be visible in our reality, right? If you're talking about a phase of existence that we live in, and hidden from our eyes is another world, then of course it must be hidden in the text of the Torah. Anything that's hidden in the Torah is hidden from us in our version of reality. If the Torah specified and talked openly, had a textual reference to a world to come, then by necessity, if you would be living in a world in which you could see a world to come. The way the Torah expresses things is very clearly the way they are in the world. The source for this in the Zohar is called Istakel Boraisa Ubara Alma. Hashem looked into the world, he looked into the Torah and created the world. Istakel Boraisa, he looked into the Torah, Ubara Alma, and created the world. Indicating very clearly that there was a Torah to look into way before the world was created. And that's the system. Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world. But Moshe Shapiro pointed out, I think very beautifully, why does it say Hashem looked into the Torah? Surely he remembered what he'd written. If there's one being who knows all perfectly, why did he have to look into the Torah? As if to say, to remind himself of what to create. And he pointed out that's not the way it is. Hashem obeys the rules of the Torah perfectly. Of course he obeys the rules of the Torah. What he is projected into the Torah. Therefore his mode of conduct, whatever his mode of conduct is projected into Torah. And whatever Torah is projected into the world. And therefore Hashem's deeds, so to speak, as far as we can talk about these things, map perfectly to Torah. And just like there's a law in Torah, that when a scribe writes a Sefer Torah, he's required to look into the text of the Torah that he's copying, and then copy. He may not write from memory. That's the law, right? It's one of the mechanisms of assuring that the Torah we have today is accurately transmitted through history. The Sefer, the scribe, must look into the text of the Torah that he's copying, and after looking, he writes. And therefore, if that's the law with the writing of a Sefer Torah, that must be the law with respect to the creation of the world. Hashem looks into the Torah and creates the world, just like a Sefer looks into a Sefer Torah and writes a new Sefer Torah. The world we live in is in fact nothing other than a copy of a Sefer Torah. Right? As one person put it, when you look at the world, you're looking at a massive Hagbah. Right? When a person lifts the Sefer Torah for the community to look into, that's called a Hagbah. One looks into the Sefer Torah. So when you look at the universe, you're looking at a massive Hagbah. Hashem is lifting a Sefer Torah and he's showing you a world. The world that he's showing you is a copy of the Sefer Torah. And therefore, what we have said up to this point, to summarize, is that the Torah is genetic material. It runs its program, and that appears in the world. The genes code for blue eyes, the person has blue eyes. Right? If you study a person with blue eyes and look at his genes, you'll find surely they code for blue eyes. Of course, the genes for blue eyes do not look blue. You need to know how to read genes. Torah is not little pictures of reality. You need to know how to read Torah. But if you understand the chemistry of genes, and you understand that genetic chemistry well enough, you'll know these are genes for blue eyes. And conversely, when you look at genes for blue eyes, understand the chemistry, you will reliably know that the person produced by these genes has blue eyes. That is the perfect correspondence, one-to-one, of every word in the Torah with everything in the world. Two practical examples in history of this would be that when Abraham walked the earth, Avram Avinu, he looked into the universe and he reverse engineered the whole Torah. He figured out the whole Torah. He was able to work out what the Torah must be from his looking at the world. A skilled engineer can look at a machine. He will know what the specification diagrams must have looked like. A skilled architect, look at a building, he can reconstruct in his mind what the plans must have looked like. And therefore Avram Avinu was able to fulfill the whole Torah without being given the text, because he was able to deduce what was in fact in Torah, and from that he was able to, from the world, he was able to deduce what in fact was contained in the Torah. And the converse example is that you have Avram Avinu, you have the converse example later in history is that you have Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, and King Solomon is figuring out the world from the Torah. The way he does it is he looks into the Torah and he knows the world. The Medrash says that he sent creatures to the bottom of the ocean to bring him things that he needed. He was able to grow crops in Yerushalayim that ordinarily do not grow in Yerushalayim, and the way he was able to do it was by knowing the lines of energy, the meridia that run from Yerushalayim to every part of the world, and on those lines he was able to plant the things that in fact grow in those places, knowing where they were from knowing those lines of energies. In other words, you know the Torah, you know the reality. And so we have both of those versions. We have the man who knew the world from the Torah, that is Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, and we have the man who knows the Torah from the world, that is Avraham Avinu. Right? So in summary, we're talking about a one-to-one mapping. We're talking about knowing one from the other, a one-to-one correspondence. Let me give one more example before going on to the second section of this discussion. You know that practical and sometimes painful example. Sometimes, you meet people, they tell you the laws of the Torah are no longer binding. Right? The reason is the laws of the Torah are time-bound. They were needed at a certain phase of history. Classic example, they will tell you, you know why there are rules of kosher food? The reason for kosher food is because unkosher food is unhealthy. Right? It's well known that pork, for example, harbors tapeworm, shellfish that swim around at the bottom of the ocean in coastal regions, absorbing all the effluent, all the contaminated sewage, they harbor hepatitis virus. And so these are unkosher things. In other words, the reason the Torah prohibits us from eating pork is because pork is unhealthy. The reason the Torah prohibits us from eating shellfish are dangerous and unhealthy. And therefore, the reasons for mitzvahs are practical, very wise, amazing of the Torah to know these things, amazing of the rabbis to know these things, and so they prohibit us and they keep us healthy. Right? That is nonsense. That is garbage. Of course, it's true that the Torah is also healthy. There are fringe benefits to all of Torah. A woman who keeps the menstrual separation laws will never experience certain diseases. A man who is circumcised, his wife will not develop cancer of the cervix. Certain types of cancers he will not develop. Right? Marriage quality will be enhanced in couples who keep these laws. All the laws of the Torah, and of course the laws of Kosherage, and of course the uncanny appearing knowledge of Torah has never let us down. When the Torah tells us that olive oil is healthy, absolutely correct today. Torah tells us that fish oils are very healthy, absolutely known to be correct, right? So of course the Torah is accurate and correct, and of course its practicalities are beneficial. But that's not the reason for the mitzvahs. Reasons for mitzvahs are spiritual. The fringe benefits, if you like, may be practical health value in the practical world, but that's not the reason for mitzvahs. The deep reasons for mitzvahs are always spiritual. And of course, in those conversations, there's always another step to the discussion. The next step in the discussion is, well, if the Torah's rules for kashrut were health-related, of course they no longer apply. Right? Today we can examine pork and see if it has tapeworm. Today we can discern unhealthy shellfish from healthy ones. And so what was once prohibited is no longer prohibited. And of course that statement is so ridiculous that it doesn't even need demolishing. But I'd like to point out something more fundamental here. The error is not simply the vested interest or the ulterior motive that the person wants to eat unkosher food and feels that the Torah is time-bound. There's something much more fundamental, and this is what's important to understand. The person who tells you that unkosher food was unhealthy, and therefore the Torah prohibits it, his fundamental mistake is he understands that unkosher food is unhealthy because it happens to be unhealthy. Why is pork unhealthy? Why does pork have tapeworm? Gee, I guess it evolved that way. I guess it happens to be that way in the world. And now that the world is that way, the Torah comes lately, subsequently, after the fact, and looks at reality and describes it accurately. And that's wrong, that's garbage. The Torah does not describe the world accurately. The Torah causes the world to be that way. The reason pork has tapeworm, the reason pork is unhealthy, quite possibly, is because it's unkosher. Right? It's tragically distorted to think that the food is unhealthy, and therefore it's unkosher. On the contrary, it's very likely that because it's unkosher, it's unhealthy. In other words, the spiritual reality of these foods has a certain nature, maybe negative, for Jews. And therefore, because of that, it could well be to think that shellfish are unhealthy because they evolved accidentally that way, or for any other reason. And then the Torah, knowing that with ultimate perception, prohibits it because it's unhealthy, is completely distorted. On the contrary, the contrary is probably true. When that shellfish finds himself being created and he looks at himself, he says to himself, gee, I'm a tameh fish. I'm an impure fish. The Torah says so. I better swim around in the schmutz. Right? That quite possibly is the way to see things. In other words, it's quite possible that the shellfish is unhealthy and hangs out in contaminated environments because his spiritual nature is that way. Right? That's the point. And therefore, the fundamental grasp we need to have, the radical suggestion I'm making to you, is that the world looks the way it does because the Torah says so. The Torah is not a perfect description of the world. Right? It's not a map of the territory. Map of a territory is drawn after the territory exists. The Torah is not a perfect map of the territory. The Torah is a map of the territory like the genes map to the body. The genes come first, right? And that's why the body looks the way it does. This is a map that was drawn before the territory was created. That's what's fundamental to understand about this aspect of Torah. Now, I hope that's clear. And if it is, let's go into the second part of this discussion, which is much more radical. Right? If you think that's amazing, what we discussed up to now, let's talk about the next step, which is far more radical. And it's this. You know that history fits into two phases. Right? We've referred to this before, and Mitzvah Hashem will talk about it in more depth again. History fits into two phases. A phase that we call Torah Shebiksav, the written law. Right? You have Jewish history, you have the written law, and that evolves, develops through history until we get to Purim and later Hanukkah, and after that we move into the phase of the oral law. The phase of the written law we call Gilui Panim, when Hashem revealed himself. God was revealed in the world. That was the phase of open miracles, prophecy. The world was incandescent with spiritual meaning. There was no atheism possible at that time. And then we move into the dark zone that is known as the phase of the oral law, where nothing is clear. Right? All we have now, we have no more prophecy, no more open miracles. We now have to work it out for ourselves. Right? We're in the phase of darkness. And there are many changes that took place at the time between Purim and Hanukkah, the so-called time of the men of the Great Assembly, those great figures who came and transitioned Torah from its revealed dimension into its hidden dimension, from the prophetic into the post-prophetic era, from the era of the written law when Hashem was dictating Torah openly to his prophets, into a time when the sages must come along and figure it out for themselves. Right? That is the phase. We are deep. If you take Jewish history and you conceive of it as 6,000 years, right? We moved through a time 2,400 years ago when the lights went out, so to speak, and we are way down, close to the end of history, 5,774, very, very close to a messianic or pre-messianic time. Right? The world will exist only for 6,000 years, as we know it, according to an accepted opinion in the Gemara. And therefore, we have transitioned into the phase of darkness where our work is emunah, faith, where we need to relate back to a story that we were told and a history of Torah, and we are deep in that zone. And many changes took place at the time when the written law transitioned into the phase of the oral law. But the one I'd like to point out and discuss in context of our discussion today is that when Torah transitioned into the phase of the rabbinic law, and here comes the radical message, just like Torah is formative and creative in the world, rabbinic wisdom, the wisdom and the understanding and the knowledge of people great in spirituality, their opinion and their wisdom is formative in the world. Right? The amazing message, the radical news we have here is that just like Torah comes before the world, and as Torah specifies, so the world must be, when we move into the phase of the oral law, when the Talmud says something, when the rabbis of the Talmud, people great spiritually, when they determine something, when they feel something, when they understand something, the world must dance to their tune. Right? This is an amazing idea. The way the Talmud puts it is, what do these rabbis help us, say some people? All they ever tell us is that doves are kosher and ravens are not. Now who needs them? I can look that up in the text of the Torah. I don't need a rabbi to tell me that a raven is unkosher and a dove is kosher. I can look it up in the text. What these people don't realize is that when a rabbi comes along and tells you that a certain object is kosher, right, it's not simply that he's assessing its reality. At a very deep level, he's causing it to be that way. Right? This is the deep reason why you cannot ask a rabbi a halachic question and then go and ask another rabbi and then and take his second opinion. Right? You can ask many rabbis their opinions, of course, no problem, and make up your own mind. But if you ask for a psak, is this piece of food kosher? And the rabbi tells you that it is kosher at that point. Right? He's not assessing its reality. He's causing it to be that way. And if he says it's unkosher, that is its reality. Of course, today our ability to do this is extremely limited. One should not get carried away with this. We live in an extremely limited generation. Our ability to form reality is very, very humbling, very humblingly small. So let's not get carried away with this. But in principle, a Torah opinion is not an opinion about something. It's a genetic reality underlying that fact in the world. And at deep enough level, people of Torah greatness are actually causing the world to be the way they say that it is. Right? Let's take a few examples. I think that's the easiest way to begin to understand this. Take a few examples of things that exist in reality, and let's see what the relationship is between the rabbinic opinion and these things. Right? This is an endless subject, of course, and one needs to study many examples to get the picture clearly and fully. But let's take a few examples, and perhaps we'll make it a little bit clearer. Let's take a classic example. Now, the Talmud talks about a man called Nechunya Chofer Shichin. In the time of the Mishnah, there was a man called Nechunya Chofer Shichin. He used to dig wells in order to supply water for Jewish travelers. When people would travel from their homes up to Yerushalayim, up to Jerusalem for the pilgrim festivals, he made sure they had water by digging wells to supply them with water. That was his special mitzvah. It's a side point here to know that everybody should choose a particular mitzvah and specialize in it, should become great and expert in one particular area, of course, in addition to everything else that one is obliged to do. But this man's special mitzvah was that he provided water. He lived during the time of Rav Chanina ben Dosa, the great Talmudic sage, the Mishnaic sage, great righteous individual. And one day, Nechunya's daughter fell into a well of underground water. According to some of the commentaries, it was one of her father's wells. Ironic, and makes the story even more poignant. And what happened was she fell into this well, and she could not be reached. She was in an underground section of this deep well, and her life was in danger. It was known that a person could survive in that environment only for 3 hours. And that would be the limit of survival, and they could not reach her. They could not rescue her. And after an hour, in panic, despairing, they ran in to see the great sage of the generation, Rav Chanina ben Dosa, and they said to him, Rav Chunya's daughter is in the water. What shall we do? And he said to them, Shalom. Very mysterious. Peace. Shalom. They went back. They struggled again. An hour later, things were getting more desperate. They went back and asked him again. He said, Shalom. No problem. At the end of the third hour, it was clear, right, that nobody could survive in such an environment for 3 hours. They went back and they said, time's up. And he said to them, Kfar Alsa. She's out. She emerged from the water. And sure enough, they went back and they found that she had emerged. She was safe. Look it up yourself in the Gemara, right? This is a Gemara in Baba Basra. Look it up there, and you'll see a miraculous, amazing story how she got out. But the point is that she survived. The people went back to the rabbi. They said to him, Reb Chanina ben Dosa, how did you know that she would be okay? Are you a prophet? How did you know? And of course, Reb Chanina was no prophet. He lived long after the generation of prophecy. He said, Loi Navi ani v'loi ben Navi. I'm not a prophet, and I'm not the son of the prophet. But kach amarti belibi. But this is what I said to myself. I said, is it possible that a man should labor in a mitzvah and have a child of his come to harm in that area? Is that conceivable? Is that possible? How could it be that Rabbi Nechunya Chofer Shichin digs wells to provide water for the Jewish people, and his daughter will come to harm in water? That is impossible. And therefore I knew she would be safe, and in fact, that is what turned out. Now the Gemara goes on to say that Afal Pikein, Meis Benoi Betzama. Despite this, his son died of thirst. A very, very amazing statement. In other words, Rav Nechunya Chofer Shichin, his daughter survived this potential tragedy, right? She was saved from the drowning in the water. But Rav Nechunya Chofer Shichin had a son who died of thirst. Right? Very, very strange. So the Gemara asks the obvious question. If the daughter was saved by the merit of her father's providing water, how come the son wasn't saved? And if the son was vulnerable, then how come the daughter was saved? And it answers the Gemara, the reason the son dies, says the Gemara, is because Svivav Nisar HaMoed. Around Hashem it is very stormy. That's what it says. And the meaning of this is that great and righteous people are judged by a much more exacting standard than ordinary people. And Rav Nechunya Chofer Shichin was a very great man, and therefore judged by a very, very exacting standard. And so, because he was on the spiritual level, his son was not protected, and his son was able to die of thirst. Now, the obvious question here is raised by the Shita Mukubetze's great commentary on the Talmud. The Shita Mukubetze says, this doesn't make any sense. If the girl's merit, right, if the father's merit was enough to save his daughter, it should have been enough to save his son. And if you tell me that he's judged very severely, and therefore his merit is not enough to save his son, how come it saved his daughter? Right? That's the obvious question. And the Shita answers an amazing answer. Right? Truly amazing. He says that when the boy was dying of thirst, Od lo chai oisoi tzadik, that righteous individual was no longer alive. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, the great leader of his generation, was alive when the girl was dying of thirst, but he was no longer alive when the girl was drowning, but he was no longer alive when the boy was dying of thirst. That's all he says. What does he mean? And I believe he means something truly radical. What he means is this. When the girl was drowning in the water, Rabbi Chanina said it's impossible for her to die. The reason it was impossible for her to die was because he said so. When the great Torah authority of the generation, who is Torah, Torah is vested in him, when he has an opinion, and his opinion is that it's not right and it's impossible for a girl to drown in these circumstances, in those circumstances the girl cannot drown. So to speak, Hashem's hands are tied. God's hands are tied because he makes himself subservient to the way Torah operates in the world. And the definition of Torah is what's in the heart and mind of the sages. And a great sage who defines what Torah is in his generation, when it is in his heart and mind, it is impossible for a girl to die in those circumstances, it becomes objectively impossible. But later, when Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is no longer in the world, and the boy is dying of thirst, Hashem says, thank you very much. I now take control over my universe and I run it the way I see fit. You know, there's no place in the Torah that it says that if a man labors in a mitzvah, his children will not be harmed in that area. It does not say that anywhere. Right? Hashem does not run the world according to such a rule. But when Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa posits such a rule, and he conceives that that's the way things must be, then Hashem runs the world that way. After Rabbi Chanina is no longer alive, and this is not a law of the Torah, he never promulgated a law, he simply had an opinion. When he's no longer around to have such an opinion, the world reverts to a different pattern. Right? I think that's an amazing expression of the concept of a Torah mind and a Torah opinion being formative in the world. This could never have happened before the time of the men of the Great Assembly, when Hashem revealed himself openly in the world. Then Hashem himself personally was the definition of reality. But when Rabbi Chanina is no longer in the world, and when Rabbi Chanina's generation, right, comes into being, then reality is formed by the opinions of the sages. Let me give you another example, just to take it further. I think, again, I think you need to see a number of examples, and I think that begins to make this clear. Here's another example. The Talmud says at the end of Yevamos, those who'd like to look it up, on the last Mishnah in Yevamos, the Talmud says that what happens if a person falls into a body of water? Say a man falls into some water and is submerged in the water, and witnesses see that he never emerged. And the man went under the water, they witnessed that he drowned, right, and he's presumed lost. Now, on the one hand, they never saw his body, so in order to testify that he died, they must use circumstantial evidence. They watched the water carefully, they saw the man disappear under the water, they saw that he never emerged. So they can say, right, they can say that this man, we have good circumstantial evidence that the man died. But we never saw him emerge. And that is how we know. Normally, to testify to their death, the body must be seen, right? The face must be seen, the body must be seen. In this circumstance, the body was not seen, but there's very compelling evidence that the man did not survive. And the halachic question we need to ask here is, may his wife remarry, right? Because normally when there's evidence, circumstantial evidence, weak evidence that a person has died, his wife may not remarry because, after all, she may be a married woman. We need evidence that she's a widow. So we need firm evidence that the man died. And here the Talmud says that under these circumstances, she may remarry. The reason is because although we did not see his body, we saw such compelling evidence of his death that it can be assumed that he's no longer alive and the wife can remarry. And that's what the Mishnah says. But the Gemara says something very, very amazing, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara here says something extremely surprising. The Gemara says, depends what sort of water we are talking about, right? The rabbis came along and they posited a distinction. The rabbi said, is this Mayim sheyesh laim soif, or is it Mayim she'ein laim soif? Mayim sheyesh laim soif means water that has a border. For example, let's say a person falls into a pool or a lake where the borders can clearly be seen. That's called Mayim sheyesh laim soif. In such circumstances, the woman is absolutely allowed to remarry because the witnesses saw the man disappear and they saw all the water and he never emerged, and therefore he must have been drowned. But if it's Mayim she'ein laim soif, water that has no border, right? For example, a person falls off a ship at sea and he disappears under the waves. There, says the Talmud, the rabbis made a law that she may not remarry. Because since we could not see the water beyond the horizon, possibly the man survived. He got carried by the waves, by a current, he got carried under the water, and he emerged beyond the horizon where no one could see him. Possibly he's alive, and therefore we cannot allow her to remarry, because there's a chance that he survived. And therefore, in circumstances of Ma'im she'ein lahem sof, where the borders cannot all be seen, we judge that the man is possibly alive, she may not remarry. And so the law follows that opinion. The law is that if it's Ma'im she'ein yesh lahem sof, where we see the borders, he's presumed dead, she can remarry. But if Ma'im she'ein lahem sof, where we cannot see the borders, there we assume that the person might have survived, we cannot allow her to remarry. Now, there's a famous comment on this by the Shina of Rebbe, the Divrei Yecheskel, and he says something that is absolutely amazing. The perplexing part of this Talmud, this piece of Talmud, is that we find here a stringency where we are not allowing a woman to remarry in case her husband survived. But that breaks the rules of agunas, right? We have a very, very firm rule throughout all the sections of the Talmud that deal with this, that we are always looking for leniencies. Whenever a man disappears and we're not sure if he's died, we will do anything to allow his wife to almost anything to allow his wife to remarry. We are not looking for stringencies. And here the Torah itself has been lenient. The Torah itself is clear, says the Mishnah, that if a man falls into any sort of water, his wife can remarry. Why would the rabbis make a stringency when they say that a person who's lost at sea and fell under the waves and his wife cannot remarry? We are preventing her from remarrying when almost certainly the husband has died. Small chance that he might have survived. Why are the rabbis being stringent and not allowing a woman to remarry? Goes completely against all the laws of agunas, where we will take leniencies and not put any unnecessary stringencies into place. And his answer, I think, is absolutely radical. He says this, and note this well. He says, when the Torah allows a woman to remarry because her husband has disappeared under the water, the husband's dead. The reason the husband can be presumed to be dead is because the Torah says so. If the Torah allows her to remarry, the default position must be that he died. When the sages come along and they say that she may not remarry because her husband might have survived, they just saved his life. Amazingly, when the Torah allows a woman to remarry, her husband must be dead. The Torah says so. He's died. When the sages come along, they can overturn that reality. When the sages say we do not want her to remarry, possibly her husband survived. If they say possibly, it becomes possible. And in fact, the Talmud records such a case. Rabbi AKIVA fell off a ship, and they mourned for his passing because they saw the water, they never saw him emerge. But he got carried by a wave, under the currents, under the ocean. In fact, a classic metaphor for Jewish history. He said, I held onto a plank of wood, and every wave that arrived, put my head down, the wave passed over me, and I emerged on the other side. Beautiful analogy for Jewish history. Every wave that comes to swamp us and drown us, we put our heads down, we survive, we emerge the other side when the wave is dissipated. But nevertheless, he survived, and unexpectedly walked into a seaside town. The rabbis saw him, they said, what happened to you? And he said, I survived, I was carried by the currents, I emerged beyond the horizon, and I survived. And on that incident, the Talmud says very, very portentous and amazing words. It says, Kama gedolim divrei chachamim. How great are the words of the sages. And the beginner thinks it means, how great are the words of the sages that knew that a man could survive in extreme circumstances. But it means much more than that. It does not mean that the sages were aware that someone could survive. It means that the words of the sages are so great that they made it possible to survive in such circumstances. And therefore the correct understanding here is that the sages were not describing reality. They were causing it to be that way. Now again, there are questions you could ask on this. I wouldn't take it too far. I wouldn't build anything on this. There's halachic questions that you could ask that might contradict this notion in this particular example. But I'm trying to illustrate a way of thinking. The way of thinking is that what the Torah says is a reality. We expect to find that in the world. That's the order of business. First the Torah, and then reality. Let me finish with one final example. In my book, Anatomy of a Search, you will find this example, and it's well documented elsewhere. But a fascinating example, and I'll leave you with this. What happens when two rabbis have two different opinions? Well, the question now becomes, which one will define reality? So let me give you a classic example. There was a man in Israel during the times of the Chazon Ish. We're talking about the 1940s, 1950s. This man had a lesion of his lung, some lung problem that was thought to possibly be fatal. And the Israeli doctors advised the man to go to Europe. Some clinic in Switzerland, he might have a chance. We suggest you travel there. The man went to the Chazon Ish and he said, Rabbi, what should I do? The Chazon Ish said, stay in Israel. In fact, the man remained in Israel, and he turned out to be healed. He was cured. And people went to the Chazon Ish and they said, Rabbi, how did you know the man should remain in Israel? Is it the air here? Is it the sanctity of Israel? What was your objection to him traveling to Europe? The Chazon Ish said something which perfectly illustrates our point. He said, when the man told me about the problem with his lung, I identified it as a problem that animals also have in their lungs. And the Talmud debates that particular problem. The Talmud wants to know whether that particular problem of a lung is treif or kosher. Will an animal that has this problem die within a year, or the animal survive? Right? Treif means the animal has a lethal injury. One of the signs of that is that the animal will not survive. The animal may have some problem with its lung, but it's a healing problem. Right? Glatt, of course, means glatt, kosher means smooth. There's no problem with the lung at all. But if you examine the lung of an animal and it has a problem which is healing, the animal's kosher. But if it's progressive and the animal will die from it within a year, the animal's treif. Now, this particular problem that he had of his lung turns out to be an argument in the Talmud. And it turns out to be an argument all the way through Jewish history. And the Code of Jewish law has an opinion. The Code of Jewish law, written by Rav Yosef Karo, says the animal's kosher, you may eat it. And the Sfardim, of course, can follow that ruling. But the Ramah, the great Ashkenazi authority, he rules the animal's treif. And Ashkenazi may not eat an animal that has that particular problem of its lung. A famous argument between Sfardim and Ashkenazim, between Rav Yosef Karo and the Ramah. Said the Chazon Ish, I said to myself, Rav Yosef Karo, he's the final authority in the land of Israel, right? He's the Moed Asra, the final rabbinic authority in Israel. The Ramah is the final authority in Europe for Ashkenazi European Jews. Well, if Rav Yosef Karo says this animal is kosher, what does he mean? He means this is not a lethal injury. In his opinion, a cow with this problem will survive. Put it this way, no self-respecting cow in Israel would think of dying from this problem because this problem is not lethal. But a cow in Switzerland is in big trouble if it has this problem with its lung because the Ramah says it's a lethal injury. And the Ramah is the final authority in Europe. And no self-respecting cow in Europe would dare stay alive with this problem. Because if the Ramah says the cow's dying, that cow will die. And therefore I said to myself, in Israel, where the reality is formed by the Shulchan Aruch, by Rav Yosef Karo, where a cow with such a lesion will survive, you stay here, you have a chance. But you, sir, leave and you go to Europe, right, where cows with this injury certainly die. They die because the Ramah says so. There's no hope for you. And therefore I advised the man to stay in Israel. And so he was saved by the Code of Jewish law. He was saved, in fact, healed by the power of Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, because that was his opinion. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I hope it showed you a radical vision of Torah. The written Torah forms the world, and much more radical suggestion, the rabbinic Torah forms the world in the post-biblical era where the rabbis define Torah. And therefore, when your local Orthodox rabbi tells you that this raven is unkosher or this pigeon, this dove is kosher, he's not only assessing reality. At a certain level, he's actually causing reality to be the way it is. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in our next session. All the best.